Thank you. I'm going to introduce our speaker this morning, and by the way, I want to thank all of you for coming to hear about this very important topic on the aging of our workforce. You know, us boomers, we're going to be around forever, so you don't have much to worry about. But anyway, I'll introduce our speaker now. Susan Brower is a Minnesota State demographer, and she directs the Minnesota State Demography Center. Susan became the state demographer in February of 2012. In that capacity, she travels the state and talks about the social and economic realities that are brought about by the recent demographic shifts, and that means that the Minnesota workforce is getting older. Susan's work applies to an understanding of demographic trends to changes that range from areas including the state economy, workforce, education, health, immigration, rural population changes. Susan earned her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan, specializing in demography and family sociology. She holds a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Susan, thank you for coming to address the White Bear Area Chamber of Commerce on this important topic.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. And when I'm not doing demography, I'm driving my kids around in my minivan day and night and day and night and day and night. It's good to be here this morning. I have just about 20 minutes here prepared, just kind of laying out what I think are the big trends that we'll be facing. Well, one of the big trends in workforce coming up here in the next 15 to 20 years. And then there's plenty of time for discussion after that. So if you have kind of a longer discussion question and would like to hold that till the end, that'd be great. If you have a clarification question, feel free to stop me as we go here. So let's start kind of big picture. Minnesota does really very well compared to the rest of the nation on a number of different indicators. So if you think about how we've emerged from the recession, our unemployment rate is much lower than the national average, and that's kind of open. We were really very closely matching the nation through the recession, and since the recession, we've recovered more quickly than the nation as a whole. We also look really good relative to other states, and if you think about educational attainment, health insurance rates, workforce participation, all these things we consistently land in the top 10, Minnesota does, relative to other states. The growth that we've seen in this area of the state has been strong in recent years. And you can see here, the bars are showing you the number of people added since 2010, and the dots are showing you the percentage growth of that city or that township. And you can see that there has been strong growth in your region. What's interesting lately about the growth in Minnesota, what we've seen that's different from the past, is that growth is very concentrated in the center cities. And we can see that. I promised my slides were going to get more readable, and then I show you this, right? What I want you to see here is that there's been a tremendous amount of growth in Minneapolis and St. Paul since 2010. And that's a pretty new pattern for us. Between the last two censuses, 2000 and 2010, Minneapolis added something like 30 people. I mean, it was under 100 people. It was almost no growth over the whole course of the decade. And since 2010, it's added close to 30,000. So there's a big change in terms of our growth pattern around the state, and it's kind of unfolding right now. Since 2010, in demographic terms, 2010 is like yesterday, because things move very slowly when you're a demographer. St. Paul is seeing similar amounts of growth, about 15,000 since between 2010 and 2014, which is our most current numbers. So you can see kind of just in comparison where your kind of member cities or your area cities are. A tremendous amount of growth relative to other parts of the state, but really most of the growth right now is happening in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So now I want to kind of back up a little bit, more big picture, and look at what we expect to happen in the next few decades. We're looking here at 100 years of aging, and what this graph here is showing you is that in the 1950s there were 85,000 more older adults than there were in the decade prior, in the census prior. About 55,000 in the 1960s. The number of older adults has kind of grown very steadily over those 6 decades that I'm showing you here because the state was growing. So the number of older adults was growing. So do you want to take a guess for what it will look like this decade? Don't guess lower, that's a terrible guess. You can guess in your mind. You don't have to holler it out and put yourself out there.
Oh my gosh.
I know. So when you hear policymakers yammering on about aging, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about 300,000 people this decade and additional 300,000 on top of that. So we're going from a population of older adults of about 600, 700,000 in the early 2010s, and that'll go up to about 1.2 million by the end of the 2030s. So it's compressed into a very short period of time, and we're already how old people are right now. You know, there's some migration in and out of the state. There's some mortality, you know, that we account for. But for the most part, we know that this aging trend is going to unfold just because we know who's living here right now. And if you think about this graph like it's an escalator where every 5 years everyone moves up a bar and every 5 years everyone moves up a bar, you start to get a sense for the timing with which our largest cohort here, and this is already, you know, 2012, a couple years back, you get a sense for the timing of that movement up over that 65-year-old age mark. So what does this mean? How are we supposed to think? We know that there's a large cohort of people who are moving up above age 65, beginning in about 2011 here. And we're already at 2016. So within this time period, that's where the largest cohort, where the baby boomers are moving kind of out of the labor force. So the first impacts that we're likely to feel are impacts on the labor force, just because that's the threshold they're passing. When we think about other impacts of aging, we think about long-term care, we think about healthcare costs, those kinds of how do we care for the older adult population and how do we pay for that care. That's something that's going to be important and going to be big, but that's really later on, right? This is typically when older adults reach about age 80 or so that we really have a lot of long-term care needs. What we're talking about right now, the impacts that we'll feel right now, are happening, and we're already partway through this transition as baby boomers move out of the labor force. Now, we've done some projections about how labor force will grow as baby boomers move out of the labor force. And what we found is there's going to be very little growth this decade and next decade of our working age population and our labor force, because we have so many baby boomers moving out of the labor force, despite what Mr. Snell here says. There are a lot of people who say we're going to work forever. That's true. But if you consider that movement out of the labor force and what the patterns look like right now in terms of labor force participation, we don't have enough people moving into the labor force to take their place and also account for the growth that our economy is expecting on top of that. So what we expect every year this decade is about 8,000 additional workers every year, or 80,000 additional workers in the state over the course of the decade. Now, this is a really different context than we're used to experiencing. We're really used to growing very, very rapidly, 38,000 people each year in the 90s, or 380,000 over the course of that decade. And even over the course of the recession, 25,000 people every year, or 250,000 over the course of the decade. So the growth that we're expecting this decade and next decade, just because of the movement of the baby boomers out, is much, much slower than we've experienced in the past. And this is going to be a really different context for employers, for cities, for really everyone in the state, because we're really very much focused on developing the business side of things, right? Growing jobs, growing the economy through helping businesses along, and that's still, of course, going to be an important piece. But now we're going to have a dual focus on the workforce side of things as well. How do we make sure that we have a workforce to support that growth in business that we'd like to see? So it's a new context. Are there any questions about that? Yeah.
Is this also national too?
So with respect to our age structure, so in Minnesota, we look very average compared to the rest of the nation. Some states and some metros will not experience this kind of transition as acutely because they have more migration, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But if you have a lot of people leaving and you have a lot of people moving to a state, it kind of balances that out. I'll show you what we look like with respect to migration in a minute. But in general, we kind of look like the state, or the nation as a whole. The baby boom happened across the U.S., across much of the West. So it's not only a Minnesota phenomenon, it's a national phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. So many places, many different countries and states and metropolitan areas that are experiencing this transition are doing so kind of at the very same time. So it's unique historically for us. We've never experienced a transition like this, but we're not alone. That many other places are experiencing this. So when we make our projections, what we do to make these projections is we project forward the population based on births, deaths, and migration. We actually have an assumption built into our projections that we'll see an increase in immigration, increase in migration to the state, based on the fact that we're going to see a slower growing labor force. This is something that tends to just kind of go hand in hand with population aging, with slower growing labor force, as you tend to see an increase in immigration. So we already have kind of a small, a moderate increase, I would say, a moderate increase in immigration built into these assumptions. Yeah. You know, we'll talk a little bit about climate and migration. I haven't heard, it's NORC? Okay, so this is a topic I'm really interested in as a demographer, of course, but I haven't heard it named before, so that's great. I'll look for that. Part of the issue of global warming, indeed, is how comfortable is the climate in different areas, and we'll see that probably has something to do with our immigration patterns here. The other issue is just the availability of water, and how does water as a resource impact long migration trends? And I don't know if that's a part of NORC, but that's another piece that we're kind of watching in terms of big long-term shifts. We don't build in climate change into our projections because it would just be it's not predictable in the way that births, deaths, and migration are predictable, but certainly could have an impact on these projections, definitely. Even in terms of, if you think about the what are they called? Weather events, the kind of storms and things that displace people could also impact these, that we don't build in movement based on those kinds of irregular storms, I guess. So we're already starting to see a slowdown in labor force even since 2010. So this is kind of what the growth that we saw in our labor force over the 2000s, just under, well, about 8%, 0.8%. And we've already seen that slow in the first 3 years. So this is something, again, it's unfolding right now. Many times I will hear older adults who shall remain nameless. I'm just kidding. I
don't think you hear it.
Later career adults will tell me that they're never going to retire, they're here to stay. That's true. There is a good proportion of folks in the later career stage who are still, a good proportion who are still working. But what we've seen from 2006 to 2014, those two lines that you see there, is that labor force participation looks very similar before the recession, after the recession. This is the group of baby boomers in 2014 in the circle here. You can see a little bit of a lengthening there. But really, baby boomers so far are retiring at the same rates that the generations before them. So even though we have longer life expectancies, it's not translating yet into longer times at work. That's translating into more leisure time, which I think a lot of people are happy about. Yeah. So we'll talk about this. So Wisconsin's over here. Why are they already negative in terms of so this has to do, again, with your question about how are other states doing. If states don't have, typically, we'll look at this, but if states don't have a lot of migration, the same levels that we have, for example, then you don't have that balancing out of baby boomers leaving. So, a number of states, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, are experiencing a decline in the size of their workforce, not growing. They're declining as baby boomers are leaving the workforce. So it's really an issue of how well does immigration balance the baby boomers who are leaving the workforce. So people want to know like labor force shortages. That's kind of what I'm kind of poking at, right? Is labor force shortages. Are they likely to emerge? How big? When? That kind of thing. Labor force shortages are really difficult to predict because the employment that DEED projects and the people that we project are related to each other. So we have projected that between 2015 and 2020 that we will add about 21,000 additional people to the labor force. And DEED has projected that there will be about 100,000 additional jobs during that time. So a pretty big difference in a short period of time. Now, I don't think it's actually going to play out like that because what we hope happens when we have a lot of employment is that it pulls more people into the state because there's more opportunity here. What we hope doesn't happen is that employers aren't able to grow to the extent that they would want to grow because they don't have the labor force. But that's another way that those two kind of projections play off each other. I guess I just show you these numbers to say that the impact of slower growing labor force is one that already is being felt. We talked about this earlier. It's something that's feeling, that some areas are feeling more acutely, and they've been feeling it for some time. Some areas may not feel it as much. Some industries may not feel it as much. It really just depends on what skills are required, and the geographic location of the place are a couple of the factors, and how quickly people can be trained into the jobs that employers have. So if indeed we are in the middle of a shortage, what do we do about it? Well, these shortages are probably here to stay, or at least the slower growing labor force is going to continue to unfold as the baby boomers continue to retire. And so, one of the first things we can do about this is just relax into it, know that it's here for a while, and then think about what can we do to counter it? What kind of strategies can we put in place to figure out how we can attract people to the state, retain people here at the state, and quickly train new people into the jobs that we have. These will be kind of multiple approaches that we'll need to be thinking about, that employers will need to be thinking about. So thinking about our migration, I've talked about it a little bit here. What do we look like? What does Minnesota look like with respect to how well we're doing attracting people to the state? These gold bars here are showing you internal migration, or this is on net, how many people move to Minnesota minus the people who move away from Minnesota to another state. So this is showing you, the gold bars are showing you migration within the US. And what we see in the 1990s is that we had more people moving to Minnesota than we had moving away. We had positive net migration during that time. But since about 2002, that's gone negative, and we have more people moving out of the state than we have moving to the state. Now, if we add in international migration, those are the blue bars, we can see it's positive throughout that whole series. So what we do here in Minnesota, our experience here, is that we make up for some of those losses to other states because people are moving here from other countries. Some places like Wisconsin, someone asked a question about what's going on in Wisconsin, don't have the same level of international immigration that we have here. And so they don't make up for these domestic losses. You can see this black line is when you add the two together, what happens, and we're just barely positive in terms of migration. Yeah?
To address now or later,
Yeah.
what are the differences between those in educational level and those who
Yeah.
are
The question is different a little bit if you're looking at the international component or if you're looking at the domestic component. A lot, and I believe I show you in a moment, a lot of what we see in terms of international migration is that we have a lot of migration at the very high end of skill level. One of our fastest growing groups here in Minnesota are Asian Indians, people coming from India, 85% of which have a bachelor's degree or higher. Now in Minnesota, that same number is about 33%. So you have a lot of skill coming from some countries. And then you have, at the lower end of the skill continuum, a lot of immigration too. People who are coming for the lower wage, manual types of jobs that we have here. So for the international component, it's kind of two stories. For the domestic component, we looked at this in a report a few years ago called Minnesota on the Move. And I'm remembering right now that most of the migration has to do with going to college. 2/3 of the migration has to do with going away to post-secondary school. I'm not remembering what the net gain or loss was, though. But I can sure get that for you. Yeah.
Just one thing about that international migration at Century College, there's people coming just to learn to speak English.
Yeah. So thinking about kind of how our education systems and institutions and how workforce, someone had mentioned earlier did you mention a dual enrollment program? That's a really important piece of how do you get workers into the labor force as quickly as possible? How can you find those efficiencies? How can our institutions find those efficiencies? And how do we need to adapt in terms of new needs of students? These are all kinds of the questions that these trends are raising. It sounds like that institutions are already responding to. This is just showing you who are the people who migrate. The red bars are showing you people who move away, and the blue bars are showing you, well, not people, but this is only state to state or domestic migration. This doesn't include the international component. But people want to know, like, who are we losing? If we're losing so many people, who are they? They're young people. They're 19-year-olds, 20, 21-year-olds, and they're moving to go away, most of them going to some kind of post-secondary opportunity. If we look kind of at the ages that we would expect them to return, around 25-ish, maybe a little bit before that, we do see a little bit of return migration. We see people coming back to the state a little bit, but it's not to the same level that we see the losses at the younger years. So that's kind of where we're losing the most people. So a couple points here. We do tend to lose people around the later years, around retirement years. We do tend to gain people again after retirement years, much later here in Minnesota. But by and large, people who are moving are young people. And that's no mystery. That's because they have more to gain and less to lose than other people who are later career, who don't have children in school systems, who are just out kind of experiencing the world on their own for the first time. But just keep that in mind when you think about, who are we losing? These are 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. Probably doesn't have to do with tax migration, which is a big story right now. Maybe there's some of that going on here in the older ages, but I don't know a lot of 19, 20-year-olds who are thinking about where am I going to be taxed the least and I'm going to move there. I don't think they think that way. Right. Or, honestly, think about being 19 or 20 or 21. You fall in love and you move wherever it's a partnership at that time for a lot of people. Or they go to a school and then they find new opportunities through internships or, jobs once they're in school. So this isn't a mystery. This is just kind of how life happens. Right now it's just not really playing out in our state's favor because we're losing more. Unlike the 90s where we were gaining those young people. So this is just kind of a new context for us, new being in the last 20 years. See, I told you demographers are kind of slow. So, what can we do about this? I think for employers, we've talked about some of the responses of our institutions, educational institutions, and that's going to be an important piece. For employers, we need to just be thinking about finding talent in new and interesting ways, ways that we haven't tried before. If we always have recruited in a certain way and expect our employees to kind of show up at our door fully trained and ready to step into the jobs we have, that might not be an assumption that works very well going forward. We may need to be thinking more about partnerships with school systems. We need to be thinking maybe younger. Maybe we need to be thinking about retraining workers who have already had a career and are looking to make a change. So there's all kinds of people who have been underutilized in the past or who are looking for new opportunities. And so, finding those matches is what's going to be important for employers. I promise you, if you look at my slides, you'll be able to read them very clearly on your own computers. I'm not sure, but thank you. That's all I have prepared. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. For the sake of time, I didn't include that piece that I often cover. Most of our growth is coming from populations of color. In Minnesota, we're already seeing a decline in the working age population who are white non-Hispanic, and growth in the number of people in the labor force who are people of color. When we look at our age structure as a state, as you get younger and younger, you get more and more diverse. So school systems are feeling the diversity that our workplaces will feel and will experience in the coming years. And when we see some of those disparities, disparate outcomes in academic achievement and attainment, this is even more concerning under these conditions that I've kind of laid out in terms of labor force growth. So it's going to be incumbent on all of us to figure out, at the very same time we're kind of dealing with all of these changes, we're going to need to be thinking about how can we make our institutions, including education, but all kind of institutions that touch young people's lives, how can we make them more effective and efficient so that they see kind of those attainment, the attainment that we see of white students. It's a big deal. If we have these gaps at the same time that we have very, very little growth in the labor force, it's an even bigger issue than when we're growing very, very rapidly. I don't know if you would want to add anything to that, but that's the way that I see it is that some of the economic or educational disparities that our state experiences for young people by race become even more urgent right now under these conditions.
One issue that does at least indirectly impact the workforce, do you have any information about, for example, how old people are on average in this area now, and then how old they might have been back in 1990 or 2000? Is that information available in your office?
In terms of workers?
Yeah, the average age of somebody in a community like Montevideo or White Bear.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that I would be happy to share with you. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
So right now, I can tell you for the state overall, and actually I pulled those numbers yesterday, but I don't have every community that's covered here. The median age is, what I wanted to show you was, the median for the state is about 37 years right now, which is the national average. We talked about how average we are. It's really as this big cohort has moved up through the ranks that we've seen that change, that age change. Of course, when you're looking at the community level, it has so much to do with your schools, with your housing stock, with all the kinds of things that shape your cities and townships. So yeah, I would be happy
Okay,
to
I'll
share that
send
with you.
out.
I love all these hands. Yeah.
So here we sit as a Chamber of Commerce,
Yeah.
an advocate for business. And we are all thinking and wondering, as a little trucking company, we wonder, will we have enough truck drivers?
Yeah.
Do they want to do that kind of work?
Yeah.
Where will we find them? But there's other businesses, cities represented here. And we have a demographer for the state of Minnesota. Do public policymakers come to you and say, so what would be good policy to increase the workforce, to increase inbound migration to our state, because we need workers? We don't have enough.
Yeah.
What can we do as a state, from your vantage point, to increase our migration, to increase our numbers of workers?
This is something, and if you are interested in this issue, Greater MSP has taken it on, and they've said in a really, I think, a really thoughtful way, said, what is it that we can do? That very question. What is it that we can do to get people to move here and to stay here? And what they have done was, what they figured out, or what they're running on, I guess I should say, is they think that it has to do with social connections once you get here. There's really very little we can do with respect to our climate. It can be hard to get people to move here, and the data bear that out as well, that Midwestern states and states in the Northeast don't see the same level of migration as states in the West and the South. That may change. That may change as our climate changes. What Greater MSP has done has said, okay, how do we get people who've moved here, welcome them here, and make a place that's fun, even though it's cold? How do we get those social connections? And so they have all kinds of, it's called Make It MSP, and they have a website. I know I see some heads nodding. They're working very hard to kind of bring those social events so that people immediately feel welcomed, feel integrated as quickly as possible, which is, given their research, the thing that keeps people here. That's the thing that's otherwise missing. We have the jobs, we have, the quality of life. So for those young people, those potential movers, what else is it that they're looking for? It's not tax climate usually. Is this a fun place to be? Is there a good, interesting, culture going on here for young people? And so that's kind of what they're looking to kind of raise up. Yeah. I mean, I've looked at it for a few industries, and I would say that absolutely it's going to be different by industry. Part of that has to do with the average age of workers. If it's work that is more physically laborious, workers just can't hold on, and you don't get that same kind of buffer that you might get from older workers staying on longer. We do see kind of a split for people in the higher skills, higher educated workers tend to be the ones that hold on to the older adults longer. So that's, if you think about the construction industry, for example, it's really hard to continue doing the same job as a 60-year-old that you did as a 20-year-old. But then, by industry, there's all these different inputs, right? The pipeline into that industry. What has been is there a sufficient flow of workers already? Are there systems set up that channel people into those industries? Can people be trained quickly in those industries? These are all factors that play into the supply of workers in a particular industry. So.
Slides where it shows that there's a little more migration back into the state.
I mean, I think what happens, what most of the research shows, is that it does have to do, that reverse migration does have to do with health, deteriorating health either of oneself or of a spouse. Not necessarily to the public services. It's more, I think, although I haven't seen a study that really lays this out, it's more to caregivers, potential caregivers, to kids, right? I'm moving back to my children to be close to my children, or my children are telling me I have to move back to be close to them at this point. Yeah, so I think that is an important piece of kind of what we can expect when we look at the later age ranges of the baby boomers. So we're starting, some baby boomers will get there shortly. 2026 is when the first boomer turns 80. Of course, some people need more intense health care before that 80-year-old mark, but that's just kind of a guideline that those things are coming as well. Costs to the public system, to public budgets are absolutely coming, and we'll start to feel those increases shortly, but really the concentration of those kinds of impacts will be later on a little bit, I think.
Do you see, though, a lengthening of the lifespan due to healthcare and things like that? I mean,
Yeah. So we have seen that. There have been, of course, great strides over the decades, over the long period. We're seeing kind of a leveling off in that growth in recent years, that we're not seeing as much growth in lifespan as we have seen in earlier decades. Now that a number of improvements in healthcare and that kind of thing have been put into place. However, thinking forward, I saw a cover of Time magazine maybe about a year ago that said this baby will live to 120. And so we don't build that into these projections. That will take a while to play out because those babies have to go through all the kinds of upstream factors that influence health. I feel like I'm talking around your question. Yes, I do. What we've seen in recent years is kind of a slowing of that increased lifespan relative to earlier, in the 20th century. But that's not to say we won't see big gains again coming up here as medicine advances.
It creates
Yeah.
a special incentive.
I'm less well versed in the kind of jobs projections. Healthcare, manufacturing, and IT in many different forms are the biggies that we know will experience growth, and that have many jobs at the upper end of the income. So we also know there's going to be a tremendous amount of growth in food services, for example. But do we want to train the bulk of our people for those? We probably want to push them to the extent that we can to those higher skill kinds of jobs. I would just say that what you're doing is very much in line with what needs to be done given these demographic trends. That quick movement from training to the workplace and retraining if possible. I don't know how many non-traditional what we used to call non-traditional students there are. But thinking about that retraining as well is going to be an important piece of aligning workforce and employers' needs.
Well, just to say at Century College, the average age of our students is 26.
Yeah.
And if you just take a look at the technical students,
Yeah.
One of the technical areas goes up to 31.
Yeah.
So there's lots of older adults returning back to school
Yeah.
to get.
You think about just very, very little growth. That means the workers that we have now are pretty much the workers we have in the future, and that retraining piece becomes so much more important. And then you have to think about what are those needs of those older students. They have families. Many of them have to work. It's not the same kind of take 4 years off after high school, concentrate it with no children. and no jobs and get it done. That's just not the situation of many of those students.
We should go to Century.
And I think, you know, what's happened over the course where we've had this tremendous amount of labor force growth is we've used that diploma, the 4-year degree, as a kind of shorthand for readiness for work, which it just doesn't fit as well in some industries, and under some conditions, it's just, we just don't have that time to have that kind of inefficiency or misalignment between what we need people to be doing and what we need to be training people to do.
Listen, I want to thank everybody for coming today and you did a wonderful job. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.